The Rhine River flowed through the middle of Europe like a huge ditch protecting a castle. On this cold spring morning, the water rushed so fast that it could wash a person away in seconds. German soldiers watched from protected shelters on the other side of the river. Their rifles were ready. They knew what was going to happen. The Allies needed to cross, and crossing meant building bridges. Bridges meant things to shoot at. This is the story of how Canadian Army engineers built the longest Bailey Bridge in World War II history. It was 558 meters of floating steel stretching across Germany's most dangerous river. They did it using a plan so smart and so fast that it changed war forever. But before we learn how they won, we need to understand just how impossible everyone thought their job was. Adolf Hitler had given a simple order weeks before: destroy every bridge across the Rhine. Every single one. If the Allies wanted to invade Germany, they would have to swim. By March 7, 1945, German troops had blown up every bridge that connected France to Germany. Every road into the heart of the Third Reich now ended at a riverbank with nothing but cold water beyond. The Rhine was 980 feet wide in most places. The water moved fast enough to flip boats, and German big guns sat on hills looking over every crossing spot, ready to shoot shells down on anyone foolish enough to try building a bridge. Field Marshal Montgomery commanded the British and Canadian forces pushing toward Germany. His armies had fought across France, through Belgium, and into Holland. Thousands of tanks rolled behind his soldiers. Huge big guns followed on trucks. Supply trucks stretched for miles. But all that firepower meant nothing if it sat stuck on the west side of the Rhine. Montgomery needed his heavy equipment across that river. He needed it now. Every day of waiting meant more soldiers dying in holes in the ground, waiting for the armor support that couldn't reach them. The Americans had gotten lucky at a town called Remagen. On March 7, troops from the 9th Armored Division found one bridge still standing. German explosives had failed to blow it up completely. American soldiers rushed across before the enemy could fix their mistake. But that luck ran out 10 days later, when the damaged bridge fell down anyway, killing 28 engineers who were working on it. The metal and stone crashed into the Rhine with a sound that could be heard for miles. If the Allies wanted more bridges, they would have to build them from scratch while being shot at. Enemy watchers would call in big gun strikes. British engineers tried first at Rees, just upstream from where the Canadians would work. German watchers sat in buildings across the river with binoculars and radios. Every time British soldiers brought bridge equipment to the water's edge, shells started falling. Explosions sent up fountains of river water mixed with mud. Men dove for cover. Equipment sank. The British kept trying, but progress came in inches, not feet. Military engineering books said building a bridge this long needed days of work, maybe a week. And that was if nobody was shooting at you. The old way to cross a river during war was to use floating boats to carry troops over first. Once soldiers made the far side safe, engineers could start building. But the Rhine was different. It was too wide, too fast, too well defended. Normal floating bridges could hold light vehicles, maybe jeeps and small trucks. But Montgomery needed to move 40-ton tanks across. He needed bridges strong enough to hold the weight of an entire armored division. Over 600 companies across Britain and America were making parts for Bailey bridges, a new type of bridge made from pieces that fit together. Each piece was small enough that men could carry it by hand. But putting all those pieces together into a working bridge long enough and strong enough to cross the Rhine. Nobody had done it before, not during battle, not at this size. That's when the Royal Canadian Engineers got their orders. 3 field companies, the 29th, 30th, and 31st, would build a bridge at Rees. Not a small bridge, not a backup bridge. The longest Bailey Bridge anyone had ever tried in combat. 558 meters from bank to bank, including the ramps leading up to it. It would need to float on pontoons across the deepest part of the channel. It would need to support tanks weighing 40 tons. And it would need to go up fast before German big guns could destroy it or kill everyone working on it. Lieutenant William Fernley Brunundrit of the 30th Field Company looked at the plans and did the math in his head. 227 truckloads of steel panels, cross beams, and pontoons would need to arrive at the work site. Every piece would need to be carried by hand from the trucks to the water. No cranes, no heavy machinies, just men and muscles and working together. The bridge would take 9 500-man hours of work. Under normal conditions in peacetime, with no one shooting, this would take 4 or 5 days at least. But they didn't have 4 days. German forces were getting ready to fight again. Every hour mattered. American engineers had just finished building their own Rhine Bridge at Weisenheim, farther south, where General Patton's Third Army was crossing. That bridge measured 366 meters long. It took 18 hours to complete, and American newspapers called it an amazing achievement. The Canadians needed to build a bridge more than 50% longer. Military experts looked at the numbers and shook their heads. Impossible, they said. Maybe if conditions were perfect. Maybe if the Germans didn't interfere. But in reality, with big gunfire and fog and the chaos of war, no chance. German officers studied the same maps their enemies used. They figured out where they could shoot from. They positioned their guns. Then they made their own calculations. A bridge that long would take the Allies at least 3 days to build. Probably 4. That gave German big guns plenty of time to aim at it. They could sink the pontoons. They could kill the engineers. They could buy enough time for more soldiers to arrive. The length of the bridge was actually good news for Germany. It made the target bigger, easier to hit. The Germans felt confident. But Lieutenant Brunundrit and the Canadian engineers knew something their enemies didn't. They had spent months in Italy and France, building Bailey bridges while being shot at. They had practiced in training camps until every man could put panels together blindfolded. They had learned ways that weren't in any book. They had learned to move fast, work quiet, and think ahead. The key was treating each tent, foot panel like a piece in a huge puzzle that 6 men could lift and lock into place in under 2 minutes. 4 men could carry 1 panel. 6 men could place it. 8 men could install the crossbeams that held the roadway. If everyone knew their job and moved together like parts in a machine, the impossible became possible. And here was the secret advantage nobody understood yet. The Americans at Weisenheim had used over 400 engineers working around the clock to build their bridge in 18 hours. The Canadians planned to use just 200 men, half the crew size, to build a bridge 50% longer. Same basic bridge design, same steel panels. But better working together, smarter ways, every man doing the work of 2. The math seemed impossible, but the Canadians had proven it before in Italy and France. They just needed to prove it again when it mattered most. So on March 26, as fog rolled across the Rhine and made it almost impossible to see, the Canadians began carrying steel panels toward the water's edge. German watchers couldn't see them through the fog. Allied soldiers couldn't see them either. But the Canadians didn't need to see far. They just needed to see the next panel, the next connection point, the next step. Could they really build 558 meters of bridge in record time with half the workers while enemy guns waited to open fire the moment the fog lifted? The answer to building an impossible bridge lay in a design created 5 years earlier by a quiet British engineer named Donald Bailey. In 1940, while bombs fell on London, Bailey sat at his desk and drew an idea on the back of an envelope. What if you could build a bridge from pieces? So simple that any soldier could put them together. What if each piece was small enough to carry, but strong enough to hold a tank? What if you didn't need special tools or big machines? Just men working together like ants building a colony. Bailey's system used steel panels that were 10 feet long and 5 feet high. Each panel weighed 570 pounds. That sounds heavy until you realize 4 men could lift one panel together. That meant 140 pounds per man, about the weight of a large dog. The panels were rectangles made of welded steel, with a cross pattern inside for strength. At the corners, the steel had special connecting points, like puzzle pieces that locked together with simple pins. 6 men could grab a panel, carry it to the bridge, and snap it into place in under 2 minutes. No welding, no bolts that needed wrenches, just pins you could push in by hand. But the Canadians had added their own trick to Bailey's design. They called it the launch nose method. Instead of building the bridge from both sides, toward the middle, they built it from one side and pushed it across the gap. The front of the bridge got pointed steel pieces attached to make a nose shape like the front of a ship. Then the whole bridge sat on rollers, metal wheels that let it slide forward. Men pushed from behind, or sometimes they attached the rollers to a truck and used the engine to pull. The bridge slid across empty air, reaching toward the far bank like a metal arm stretching across the river. Once the nose touched the other side, workers removed the rollers, added the wooden road surface, and locked everything down. It was brilliant, because you didn't need anyone on the far side helping. You didn't need boats in the middle holding things up. You just needed strong backs and good timing. The Canadians knew this system worked, because they had already proven it while being shot at back in Sicily in 1943. The 3rd Field Company Royal Canadian Engineers had built the first Bailey Bridge ever built, while enemy soldiers shot at them. The town was called Lionforte. German machine guns fired from the hills. Shells exploded in the streets. But the Canadian sappers kept working, kept lifting panels, kept connecting pieces. That bridge went up, and Allied tanks rolled across to attack the German positions. The enemy couldn't believe it. 1 hour, the Canadians had no way forward. 2 hours later, armor was crossing a river the Germans thought was safe. Then came the Sangro River in Italy, December 1943. That bridge stretched 330 meters, the longest anyone had built in combat so far. It took planning and sweat and men working through the night in freezing rain. But it worked. Tanks crossed, troops followed. The advance continued. By March 1945, Canadian field engineers had built dozens of Bailey bridges across rivers from Sicily to France. They knew every trick. They knew how to read the water to place pontoons. They knew which panels to double up for extra strength. They knew how to work in the dark, using only touch and whispered instructions. They were ready. At noon on March 26, 1945, the order came down. Begin building. The fog still hung thick over the Rhine, turning the world into gray soup, where you could barely see 20 feet ahead. That fog was a gift from heaven, because German big gun watchers across the river couldn't see what was happening. The 30th Field Company took responsibility for the home bank, the west side where the bridge would start. The 29th Field Company got the dangerous job of making the far bank safe, the east side where German soldiers might still be hiding in basements and rubble. The 31st Field Company focused on the floating section, the pontoons that would hold up the middle of the bridge where the water ran deepest. British pioneers joined to help, bringing the total workforce to over 200 men. Everyone had a specific job. Some men drove trucks bringing in the steel panels. Each truck carried about 30 panels, which meant 227 truck trips just to deliver all the materials. Other men worked as handlers, grabbing panels off trucks and carrying them toward the building area. Still others worked as assemblers, the experienced engineers who knew exactly how each piece fit together. Squad leaders called out commands in low voices. No shouting. Sound carried across water, and the last thing anyone wanted was to alert the Germans before the bridge was half built. The panels came in bundles wrapped in canvas to protect them during shipping. Men cut the canvas away and lifted the first panel. It was cold to the touch, the steel sucking heat from their hands even through gloves. 4 men grabbed the corners. They lifted together, one calling the count. Up, move, set. The panel slid into the starting position. The beginning of what would become the longest Bailey Bridge in history. Pins went through the connection points with a metal click that sounded too loud in the foggy silence. Another panel came forward. Click, click. The bridge began to grow. Each panel was 10 feet long. To cover 558 meters, they needed to place panel after panel after panel in perfect order. The bridge would need 34 separate floating sections in the middle, each section 42 feet long, plus one shorter section of 32 feet, where the depth changed. On the banks, the landing sections needed to be even stronger, built to Class 70 standard instead of the usual Class 40. That meant doubling up panels, putting one on top of another for extra support. Class 40 meant the bridge could hold 40-ton tanks. Class 70 meant it could hold trucks towing big guns, the heaviest loads in the Army. The crossbeams came next, the beams that connected the two sides of the bridge and held up the road surface. Each crossbeam needed 8 men to place it properly. They had to lift it high, slide it into position between the panels, and lock it down tight. Wooden planks called chesses would eventually cover the crossbeams to make the actual road that vehicles would drive on. But that came later. First, you built the skeleton. Then you added the skin. Problems started immediately. The supply trucks got lost in the fog. A driver took a wrong turn and ended up 2 miles away before someone noticed and guided him back. That delayed the schedule by an hour. Then the fog started to lift around 2 p.m., and German watchers finally saw what was happening. Big gunfire started coming in. Shells screaming overhead and exploding in the river. Huge columns of water shot up, soaking the workers. One shell hit a supply truck, destroying 20 panels before they could even be used. 2 men got wounded by metal pieces and had to be carried away to field hospitals. But the Canadians didn't stop. They changed their rhythm, working faster during the quiet moments and taking cover during attacks. The fog rolled back in around sunset, giving them another few hours of protection. Through the evening and into the night, they worked by moonlight and the dim glow of covered lanterns. The clang of steel on steel echoed across the water. The splash of pontoons being positioned, the grunt of men lifting heavy loads for the 10th hour straight, their muscles screaming, but their hands still steady. This was what they trained for. This was what they were good at. Panel by panel, section by section, the bridge reached out across the Rhine, like a steel finger pointing straight at the heart of Germany. At noon on March 28, 1945, just 48 hours after the first steel panel was placed, Lieutenant Bernundret stood at the west end of Blackfriars Bridge and watched as a column of tanks rolled onto the wooden surface. The bridge didn't shake. It didn't groan. It just sat there on its floating pontoons, solid as a road, carrying 40 tons of steel and men across water that had protected Germany for 1,000 years. 558 meters of impossible engineering, now made real. The soldiers cheered. Some cried. Others just stared in disbelief. 2 days ago, this had been a dream on paper. Now it was saving lives. The numbers told a story that even generals had trouble believing. Before the bridge, Montgomery's forces sat stuck on the west bank with no way to bring heavy equipment forward. Infantry crossed in small boats, but fought without tank support, without big guns, without the armor that kept them alive. After the bridge opened, everything changed in hours. Trucks loaded with bullets rolled across in steady streams. Big guns followed, their crews already planning shots for targets miles ahead. Tank after tank crossed, their commanders standing in the hatches and waving at the engineers who had built their highway to victory. In the first 24 hours alone, over 3,000 vehicles used the bridge. By the end of 2 weeks, more than 60,000 military vehicles had crossed at Rees. 60,000, each one bringing men and bullets and fuel closer to ending the war. The Canadians had built the bridge at a rate of 11.6 meters per hour. That meant every 60 minutes another 38 feet of steel reached across the Rhine. But here's what made American engineers stop and take notes. The U.S. Army bridge at Weissenheim used over 400 soldiers working 18 straight hours. That's 200 man-hours for 366 meters of bridge. The Canadians used just 200 men working in rotating shifts across 48 hours. That's 500 man-hours for 558 meters. Do the math. The Americans needed 19.7 man-hours for every meter of bridge. The Canadians needed only 17 man-hours per meter. With half the crew size at any given moment, they built a longer bridge more efficiently. Every man knew his job. Every team worked together. No wasted motion, no confusion. Just smooth, practiced working together that turned individual effort into something much greater. The world took notice fast. American military engineers studied what the Canadians had done and immediately started copying the methods. The United States had already bought the rights to the Bailey Bridge design from Britain and renamed it the Portable Panel Bridge. But now they wanted to learn the Canadian ways of building. The question wasn't about the steel panels anymore. Those were the same. The question was about the people. How did you get 200 men to do the work of 400? How did you organize smaller crews for maximum speed? How did you build longer bridges with fewer hands without losing quality or safety? The Canadian answer came down to training and methods. Every man learned multiple jobs. Squad leaders planned 3 steps ahead. Teams practiced until they could work in complete darkness by touch alone. Within weeks, American units across Europe were practicing these methods. They ran drills on timing and working together. They measured themselves against the Canadian standard of doing more with less. By the end of World War II, Allied forces had built over 500 Bailey bridges across Europe alone. In Sicily and Italy, the British 8th Army and American 5th Army built more than 3,000 Bailey bridges, totaling over 55 miles of bridging. The average bridge length was 100 feet, making them much smaller than Blackfriars. But each one used the same basic system that Donald Bailey had drawn on an envelope, and the Canadians had perfected while being shot at. Over 600 companies made bridge parts during the war. They produced 700,000 panels, enough steel to stretch from London to Leningrad if you laid them end to end. That's over 500 miles of possible bridging, all based on a design that let 4 men carry each piece. The Germans watched this happen with growing fear. They threw everything they had at the Rhine bridges, trying desperately to destroy what Allied engineers kept building. Floating mines drifted downstream, explosive charges designed to blow holes in pontoons. The Canadians hung nets across the water to catch the mines before they hit the bridge. German soldiers loaded boats with explosives and tried to ram them into bridge supports. Allied machine gunners shot the boats before they got close, turning the Rhine into a shooting range. German big guns fired constantly, day and night. Shells screamed in and exploded around the work sites. Some hit supply trucks. Some hit the water. A few hit the bridge itself, damaging panels that had to be replaced. But repair crews worked just as fast as building crews had. Damaged sections got cut out and new panels installed in under an hour. The Germans even used their newest weapons. V-2 rockets, the world's first rockets that could go into space, got aimed at Rhine crossing points. These were the same rockets that had scared London, flying faster than sound and hitting without warning. Several V-2s targeted bridges in the Rhine Valley. One came close to Blackfriars, missing by only 200 meters and leaving a hole in the ground big enough to park 3 trucks inside. The super heavy cannons came next, 600-millimeter guns that fired shells weighing over a ton each. The blast from one of these shells could flip a tank. Several hit near the Rees crossings, but the bridges kept standing. Then came the Arado R-234 jets, Germany's new jet bombers. These planes flew faster than anything the Allies had and carried bombs specifically designed to destroy bridges. They made several runs over the Rhine, dropping their loads through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. Some bombs hit the water, some hit the banks, but the bridges survived. The Canadian advantage was simply, they could build faster than the Germans could destroy. Even if big guns damaged a section, repair crews fixed it before the break stopped traffic. Even if a V-2 rocket landed nearby. The modular design meant replacing damaged panels instead of rebuilding from scratch. The Germans were fighting old-style warfare, where destroying a stone bridge meant months of delay. But Bailey bridges were modern engineering, where destruction just meant a few hours of inconvenience. The mental impact hit both sides hard. Allied soldiers gained confidence with every bridge that opened. If engineers could build while being shot at, if they could span the widest rivers while shells fell around them, then maybe this war was actually winnable. German troops felt the opposite. They watched bridges appear overnight. They watched their best weapons fail to stop them. The mighty Rhine, their last natural defense, had become just another river that Allied tanks drove across like it was a puddle in the road. Morale collapsed. Units surrendered rather than face the endless stream of enemy equipment pouring across bridges that shouldn't exist. Nobody expected what happened after the war ended. The Ontario Hydro Electric Power Commission in Canada bought huge amounts of extra Bailey bridging equipment. They weren't building bridges to carry tanks. They were building things for peacetime. Over 200,000 tons of bridging materials went into hydro-electric projects across Ontario. Office buildings got built using Bailey panels as structural supports. The steel that had been designed for war became the skeleton for buildings where people worked and lived. For years after 1945, Ontario held more Bailey Bridge equipment than any military in the world. Then came Hurricane Hazel in October 1954. The storm destroyed dozens of bridges across southern Ontario. Rivers that normally ran calm turned into raging floods that swept away stone and concrete structures built to last for decades. But the government still had all that war, extra Bailey equipment sitting in warehouses. Within days of the storm, crews set up Bailey bridges as emergency replacements. Some were meant to be temporary, but those temporary bridges worked so well that communities kept them permanently. The old Finch Avenue Bailey Bridge in Toronto, built by the 2nd Field Engineer Regiment, still carries traffic today. 70 years after Canadian soldiers first learned to put these panels together while being shot at in Europe, their grandchildren drive across them on the way to work. Picture the scene one more time. March 27, 1945, midnight. The Rhine turns black beneath scattered moonlight. German shells whistle overhead, exploding in fountains of spray that drench everyone within 50 feet. Through the darkness, you hear only rhythm. The clang of steel on steel. The splash of pontoons hitting water. The grunt of men lifting 570-pound panels for the 100th time that day. No shouting, radio silence. Just working together born from months of practice. 6 men per panel moving like one body. 8 men per crossbeam. Working with the timing of a clock. Every soldier knows one mistake sends the entire bridge and all his brothers into the freezing river below. But mistakes don't happen. Not when you've trained this hard. Not when lives depend on getting it right. The fog rolls back in, hiding them from German watchers. The work continues. Panel after panel, section after section, a steel road growing across impossible water, built by men who refused to believe in impossible. The war ended in May 1945, just 2 months after Blackfriars Bridge opened for traffic. Germany surrendered. Soldiers went home. The huge armies that had rolled across Europe began shrinking back to peacetime size. But the Bailey bridges stayed. They sat there in the ruins of bombed cities and blown river crossings. These simple steel structures that had helped win the greatest war in history. People walked across them on the way to work. Farmers drove tractors over them to reach fields. Children played near them, climbing on the girders while their parents worried they would fall. The bridges became part of the landscape, so normal that within a few years most people forgot they had been built for war. Donald Bailey, the man who drew the original design on an envelope back in 1940, received a knighthood in 1946. King George VI tapped him on both shoulders with a sword, and from that moment on he was Sir Donald Bailey. But the money came much slower. In 1985, 40 years after his invention helped win World War II, the British government finally paid him for $12,000 for the patent rights, fee $12,000 for a design that had been made into 700,000 panels and saved countless thousands of lives. Bailey died that same year at age 84. He lived long enough to see his bridges on every continent, in every kind of place, solving every kind of problem. But he never got truly rich from the idea that changed military engineering forever. Lieutenant William Fernley Bernundret went home to Canada when the war ended. The 29th, 30th, and 31st Field Companies of the Royal Canadian Engineers disbanded as soldiers returned to civilian life. Some became construction workers building houses and roads. Others went into teaching or farming or business. They scattered across Canada and rarely talked about what they had done in Germany. That was common for combat engineers. Everyone wanted to hear stories about tank battles and infantry charges. Nobody threw parades for the men who built bridges, but those bridges made every battle possible. Without the engineers, the tanks never moved. The infantry never advanced. The war never ended. The Royal Canadian Engineers kept Blackfriars Bridge in their official history. The story got told to new recruits during training. Young soldiers learning to be combat engineers heard about the 9 500-man hours and the 558 meters and the 48 hours that shouldn't have been enough time, but somehow was. The 3 field companies earned honors and recognition from the Canadian military. Though their names never became household words, like famous generals or fighter pilots, their legacy lived in a different way. Every Canadian combat engineer regiment that came after them learned the same lessons: break big problems into small pieces, train until the movements become automatic, trust your team, work fast but work right. Those rules from March 1945 still guide Canadian military engineers today. The motto of the Royal Canadian Engineers is "Ubique," a word meaning everywhere. They earned that motto building bridges like Blackfriars in places where everyone said bridges couldn't be built. The Bailey Bridge design became the standard for military forces around the world. The American military adopted it fully and created their own version, called the M2 Bailey, with a wider roadway to handle bigger trucks. That M2 variant is still the primary assault bridge used by the United States Army today, 80 years after Donald Bailey drew his first sketches. NATO forces all train on Bailey Bridge systems. If you join the military in any Western country and become a combat engineer, you will learn to put these panels together. The basic design hasn't changed much because it doesn't need to. Simple works, strong works, fast works, those qualities matter just as much now as they did in 1945. More than 100 permanent Bailey bridges still stand in Canada alone, serving regular civilian traffic. These aren't military places. These are normal bridges that cars and trucks use every single day in small towns and country areas. Some have been in place for 70 years. They rust a bit on the outside, but the main structure stays solid. Engineers check them regularly and replace worn parts. But the main framework remains the same steel panels that were designed to be temporary battlefield solutions. Turns out temporary can last a lifetime if you build it right. The modern world keeps proving why Bailey bridges matter. In 2013, huge floods hit Calgary, Alberta. Rivers overflowed their banks and washed away bridges that had stood for decades. People got trapped on the wrong side of the water, with no way to reach hospitals or stores or their own homes. The Canadian military arrived within hours, bringing Bailey Bridge equipment on trucks. Within days, temporary bridges spanned the flood, damaged crossings. Those emergency bridges stayed in place for months, while permanent replacements got designed and built. Some of the soldiers putting those panels together in Calgary were grandchildren of men who had built Bailey bridges in Europe during the war. The skill passed down through generations. Michigan had the same crisis in 2020 when the Edenville Dam failed. Floodwaters destroyed bridges across the region. The Michigan Department of Transportation rushed a Bailey Bridge to an important crossing on Highway M30, reconnecting communities that had been cut off. That bridge still carries traffic today, while engineers plan a permanent structure. New Zealand faced similar problems in 2023 when Cyclone Gabrielle tore through the North Island. Roads got washed out. Bridges collapsed. Communities lost contact with the outside world. Bailey bridges arrived by helicopter and truck, carried in pieces and put together on site. Within a week, supply lines reopened. Aid reached isolated towns. All because of a design created for World War II that still works perfectly for natural disasters 80 years later. India uses Bailey bridges constantly. The country has mountains, deep valleys, and rivers that flood every monsoon season. The Indian Army has become expert at setting up Bailey bridges in remote areas where building permanent structures would cost millions and take years. In 2018, after a deadly stampede at a Mumbai train station, the Indian Army put up 3 new Bailey foot bridges in record time. The bridges prevented future tragedies by giving commuters safe paths away from overcrowded platforms. Those bridges weren't for tanks or military vehicles. They were for ordinary people going to work. And they saved lives just as surely as battlefield bridges saved soldiers. The lesson from Blackfriars Bridge echoes through every one of these modern uses. Innovation under pressure creates solutions that last. The Canadians in 1945 didn't have time to overthink or plan perfectly. They had enemy big guns firing at them and a river that wouldn't wait. So they focused on what worked. They broke the huge problem of crossing the Rhine into small problems of placing one panel at a time. They trained until good became great, and great became automatic. They adapted a British design with their own methods. They refused to accept that something was impossible just because nobody had done it before. That kind of thinking wins wars, but it also builds civilizations. Every major advance in human history came from someone looking at an impossible problem and asking, "What if?" instead of accepting, "No, what if we could fly? What if we could cure diseases? What if we could talk instantly across oceans? What if we could build a bridge in 2 days that should take 2 weeks?" The Canadians at Rees answered there, "What if?" with action. They proved that sometimes the greatest advantage isn't having more soldiers or bigger weapons. Sometimes it's having smarter methods and better training, and the courage to try something everyone says won't work. Modern military engineers still study the Rhine crossings in their training courses. They analyze the planning, the timing, the crew working together. They calculate man-hours per meter and compare different ways. But the real lesson isn't in the math. The real lesson is that human determination combined with good design can overcome almost any obstacle. More soldiers doesn't always mean faster results. Bigger crews don't guarantee better bridges. The Canadians proved that 200 well-trained engineers could do better than 400 average ones. They showed that working together beats numbers. That methods beat brute force. The Rhine had been a fortress barrier for centuries. German armies used it as their final defense line. But 3 Canadian field companies working with half the workers made it meaningless. They turned Germany's greatest natural protection into just another river with a bridge across it. 80 years have passed since that foggy morning when the first steel panels went into place. The men who built Blackfriars Bridge are nearly all gone now. The last veterans are in their 90s, their hands that once lifted 570-pound panels now shaking with age. But their work lives on. Every time a disaster strikes, and Bailey bridges appear to reconnect broken communities, those old soldiers are there in spirit. Every time a military force needs to cross a river, while being shot at, they're using methods perfected at Rees. Every time an engineer looks at an impossible deadline and figures out how to meet it anyway, they're following in the footsteps of Lieutenant Brunundrit and the sappers who refused to quit. March 28, 1945. The Blackfriars Bridge opened to Allied traffic at noon, exactly 48 hours after Canadian engineers started work. In those 2 days, they didn't just build the longest Bailey Bridge in history. They proved that the impossible is just the difficult that nobody has figured out yet. They showed that good training beats raw numbers, that smart planning beats brute force, that teamwork beats individual talent every single time. The Rhine had protected Germany for 1,000 years. 3 field companies made it meaningless in 2 days. That's not just engineering. That's genius on a battlefield. And it's why 8 decades later, when disaster strikes anywhere in the world, the first solution engineers reach for is still a Bailey Bridge. The design that won World War II, one steel panel at a time, still saves lives today, because some ideas are so good they never go out of style. Some innovations are so perfect they work forever. And some bridges built in desperate times by determined people last long enough to call into the future.